It might seem a little silly for me to ask why we care about ethics. There are a lot of examples of situations where people were harmed because other people weren't being ethical. The historical examples can sometimes make it seem like those issues are a thing of the past, though, especially when we read about institutional research boards, informed consent, animal care and use committees, and all the other oversight mechanisms in research. Those processes do make it pretty rare to see a publication or a presentation of a study that has potential to harm participants. There are some gray areas, though, that can influence the results of a study, and that's one reason we need to think about the various ethical criteria. The textbook explains two main points of reference for evaluating the ethics of psychological research: the principles from the Belmont Report and the APA Ethical Guidelines. When you reviewed the APA Ethical Guidelines, you might have noticed they represent more specific points related to the Belmont principles, so they can provide a helpful reference point as we're thinking about designing studies and evaluating published studies. When we talked about variables in the recruitment process for the Burton and King article, you might have wondered about the fact that the researchers used information from health center visits as part of the study. That could create concerns about beneficence if someone other than the researchers looked at the data, which is part of the reason the APA ethical guidelines emphasize record keeping. Using the health center records along with the information from the surveys also adds to concerns about confidentiality, because the researchers would need to include identifying information on the surveys to match them with the health center information. Two parts of the methods let us know the researchers followed ethical guidelines and the participants were aware that their health center visits would be reviewed. In the participants, the authors mentioned the sign-up sheet referred to the health center visits, so that would be the first way the potential participants knew the health center was involved. Then, in the procedure, they mentioned the consent form, which we'll learn about in more detail, which included a release for all health center data. You might also wonder about autonomy if students receive credit for participating. In the IRB application, the researchers probably had to explain what alternative would be provided to students, so those who were not comfortable participating still had an option to earn credit. This is a shorthand I use to make notes about those thoughts. These issues aren't substantial enough to make us concerned that participants were harmed, but we might keep it in mind that they might have influenced the results by influencing who participated in the study. If you haven't already done so, please pause the recording to open your files for the Burton and King article and add the information from the previous slides. The study reported in the Hearst article did not directly use human or animal participants, so the related ethical guidelines don't apply. In most cases, a review study does not need to go through an IRB board. The nature of these types of studies also reduces the chances of fraud or plagiarism in published work because the authors of other publications could call it out so easily. Make sure to make a quick note for the Hearst article, then look at Schifrin and Nelson and complete the ethics section of the worksheet for that article. A study in Schifrin and Nelson creates very little concern about ethics. The credit for general psychology can create concerns, as I mentioned with Burton and King, but typically there's an alternative to avoid the concerns about autonomy. Situations where participants receive class credit can create concerns about record keeping and confidentiality because the instructor needs to know who participated or earned credit. That can be accomplished in a few ways that don't create those concerns, though. In most institutions, this study would be considered low risk enough to go through a process called exempt IRB review. Exempt doesn't mean it's exempt from review altogether, just that the full committee doesn't need to review it to confirm. While our notes in this area might be pretty minimal, they serve two important purposes. One is helping us think about what might be influencing the findings. Though if an article is published, it means the journal editors and reviewers did not have concerns the findings were inaccurate. Another purpose for making these notes is to help us think about the details we need to think about when we design studies. For example, if we plan to offer an incentive for participation, we need to make sure we can provide that to participants while still maintaining confidentiality and respecting autonomy.